That night, I dragged myself through the door later than usual, exhaustion weighing heavy on me. All I wanted was to kick off my boots, sink into my recliner, and crack open a cold beer. The sharp scent of fresh laundry greeted me the second I stepped inside, telling me Melissa had been at it again. She had this obsession with keeping the house spotless. Even though it was just the two of us, the faint drone of the dryer hummed in the background as I headed toward the living room. When I went to toss my jacket into the laundry basket by the door, something unusual caught my attention. Sitting right on top of the pile was a gray hoodie with a logo I didn't recognize. Frowning, I picked it up and turned it over in my hands. It wasn't mine, and there was no way it belonged to Melissa. She wouldn't be caught dead in something so plain. I brought it closer to my nose, expecting her perfume, but instead it reeked of sweat and cheap cologne. My curiosity flared. "Melissa," I called out, heading toward the kitchen where I could hear the faint clatter of dishes. She appeared a moment later, leaning around the corner with a dish towel in hand. "What's up?" she asked casually. I held up the hoodie. "Who is this?" "It's not mine." Her expression didn't waver. Without missing a beat, she shrugged and flashed one of those dismissive smiles. "Oh, that's Jason's," she said. "Oh, he's been helping me out around the house while you're at work? Thrown it in the wash by mistake." "Jason," I repeated, frowning deeper. Jason was the guy from down the street, not exactly a kid anymore, probably mid-20s. Built like a brick wall, he was always doing odd jobs for the neighbors, doing odd jobs for the neighbors, lawns, cleaning gutters, fixing fences. I'd seen him around plenty, but hadn't expected him to be working here. "Since when is Jason helping out here?" I asked, my tone more suspicious than I intended. Melissa waved her hand dismissively, like it wasn't worth discussing. "Oh, a few weeks now. He's been helping with heavier things, moving furniture, fixing the yard stuff. I figured you'd be too tired for after work." Something about her tone didn't sit right. She sounded too at ease, like she prepared this explanation in advance. My stomach twisted, but I couldn't put my finger on why. Maybe I was just overthinking it. "Huh?" I muttered, tossing the hoodie back into the basket. "I'll take it to him tomorrow." Melissa cut in quickly. Almost too quickly. "Don't worry about it. I'll give it to him next time I see him." That small flicker of unease grew, but I shook it off. Melissa wasn't the type to lie, and Jason seemed harmless. A hard-working guy just trying to make a buck. Still, as I settled into my chair later that night, beer in hand, I couldn't stop my mind from wondering. Lately, Melissa had been different, not in a glaring way, but subtle things like how her phone always stayed face down on the counter, her vague answers when I asked about her day, or the fact that she'd been dressing up more often, even for mundane errands. Tried to brush it off. Marriage had its phases, right? Life wasn't always a thrill. I had a steady job, a good home, and a wife who managed everything while I worked. What more could I want? But no matter how hard I tried to push the thought away, the hoodie sitting in that basket nagged me. Something about it didn't add up. Over the next few days, I started noticing things I hadn't before, like how often Jason's truck was parked out front. The realization didn't hit me until Mrs. Hoffman, our overly chatty neighbor, flagged me down as I pulled into the driveway one evening. "Looks like your wife's been keeping Jason busy," she said with a sly grin, leaning over her fence. "What do you mean?" I asked, stepping out of the car. The cool air suddenly felt sharper against my skin. "Oh, I just see his truck here all the time," she said, lowering her voice like she was sharing some big secret. Such a polite young man, always so helpful. I bet Melissa appreciates the extra muscle. Forcing a smile, I muttered something about Jason being a hard worker and hurried inside. Sure enough, Jason's truck was parked out front, and Melissa was standing in the living room wearing jeans and a blouse I hadn't seen in years, the kind that hugged her figure a little too snugly for someone just doing housework. Her makeup was subtle but noticeable, and the faint scent of her perfume hung in the air. "Oh hey," she said brightly. "Huru, hey?" Voice too cheerful. "You're home early." "Yeah," I replied, glancing at the floor where Jason's toolbox sat open. He wasn't in sight. "What's Jason working on now?" She waved toward the backyard like it was nothing. "The garden trellis. It's been wobbly for ages, and he offered to fix it." I stepped to the back door and spotted Jason outside, hammer in hand. He saw me and waved, his expression all wave. Smiles. I raised my hand stiffly in return before turning back to Melissa. "You've been having him over a lot lately, haven't you?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. She didn't miss a beat, brushing past me as she picked up Jason's toolbox. He's just helping out. You know, with stuff that needs doing, Lucas. He's affordable, dependable, and nearby, Melissa said, her voice carrying just enough irritation to make me take notice. Besides, with how busy you are, I thought it would help take some stress off you. The explanation sounded reasonable, but something in her tone felt off, too defensive, almost rehearsed. I decided to let it go for now, filing it away for later. My colleague Dominic had noticed my distraction at work and pulled me aside one afternoon. "Everything okay at home, man?" he asked, his brow furrowed with genuine concern. I hesitated, then found myself spilling the whole story. The hoodie, the truck, the neighbor's comments. Dominic listened quietly, his expression growing more serious. "Trust your gut, Lucas," he said finally. "I've been there when something feels wrong. It usually is." Over the next few weeks, Jason's presence around the house became a constant, and so did my unease. Every day, more things started to feel wrong. I'd come home and find little traces of him. His work gloves left on the kitchen counter, a half-empty soda can sitting by the couch, or his boots parked by the front door. Melissa, too, had changed. She wasn't making major transformations, but small, subtle adjustments that I couldn't ignore. She started wearing her hair down more often. Her nails were freshly painted, and she swapped her usual sweatpants for fitted jeans and stylish tops. The timing didn't feel coincidental. These changes always seemed to line up with the days Jason was helping out. One night, I tried bringing it up, aiming for casual but direct. "Melissa," I said, watching her closely, "you've been dressing up more. Is there something going on I should know about?" She laughed, the sound light but strained. "Seriously, Lucas? You think I'm trying to impress Jason? He's just a kid. Besides," she added, flashing a practiced smile, "you know how much I love you. You've got nothing to worry about." Her words sounded comforting enough, but they didn't settle my nerves. Not when I noticed her checking her phone more often, smiling at messages she never shared. Not when neighbors started mentioning how frequently Jason's truck was parked outside. That one Saturday, I got home from running errands and found Jason's jacket draped casually over the couch. When I asked about it, Melissa claimed he was fixing something in the garage. But when I peeked in there, he was leaning against the workbench, scrolling through his phone. He didn't look like someone deep in a project. I didn't say anything right then. I just nodded and walked away. But the unease that had been gnawing at me for weeks was now impossible to ignore. By the end of that week, the pieces were piling up faster than I could make sense of them. The gloves, the fuffs, jacket, the way Melissa had started brushing off my questions. It all pointed to something I didn't want to admit. I told myself I'd wait for solid evidence before jumping to conclusions. But deep down, I already knew. And then fate decided to intervene. If my boss hadn't let me off early that night, I might have gone on living in denial a little longer. But instead, I came home to find the truth staring me in the face. It was just after 9:00 when I pulled into the driveway. The first house was dark except for a faint glow spilling out into the backyard. That struck me as odd. Melissa wasn't one to sit outside at night. I turned off the engine and stepped out of the car, immediately noticing Jason's truck parked a few houses down, tucked just far enough away to seem discreet. My stomach turned. I moved quietly toward the backyard, each step feeling heavier than the last. The crunch of gravel under my boots sounded deafening in the still night. As I got closer, I began to hear voices, soft laughter mixed with murmured words I couldn't quite make out. When I reached the fence, I peered through a small gap in the wooden slats, and there they were. Melissa and Jason sat close together on the patio bench. Her hand rested casually on his thigh, as if it belonged there. He was wearing the same gray hoodie I'd found in the laundry weeks ago. Then I saw it. She kissed him. It wasn't an innocent peck or something I could excuse as a misunderstanding. This was intimate, practiced, and familiar. Her hand slid up his chest as he pulled her closer, his arms wrapping around her like it was second nature. I froze. The world tilted beneath me as the reality of what I was seeing crashed down. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but stand there, rooted to the spot, watching my wife kiss another man in the backyard of the house we shared. I don't know how long I stood there, but eventually, I stumbled back toward the front yard, my hands trembling as I fumbled with my keys. The thought of confronting them burned in my chest. but something held me back. Instead, I sank onto the couch, staring blankly at the wall. They'd been in my home. Jason had been sitting on my furniture, drinking my beer and laughing behind my back. And Melissa had done this without a shred of guilt. She didn't look like someone weighed down by secrets. She looked happy. As I sat there, the pieces started falling into place. Her dressing up, the vague excuses about errands, the hoodie in the laundry. It all made sense now, each revelation cutting deeper than the last. But the worst part wasn't the betrayal. Audacity. They weren't just sneaking around, they were doing it here, in plain sight, as if I were too blind or stupid to notice. I wanted to march out there, tear Jason apart, and demand answers from Melissa, but I didn't. Something about the confidence in her kiss, the way she acted so sure of herself, told me that she'd just twist the truth. If I confronted her now, she'd call me paranoid, make me the villain, and somehow turn this around on me. No, I wouldn't let her off that easy. If she wanted to play games, I'd play too. But this time, I'd win. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, anger and betrayal, warring with a cold, determined resolve. By the time the sun rose, I made up my mind. I wasn't going to confront her. Not yet. First, I needed undeniable proof. If Melissa thought she could weasel her way out of this, she was wrong. This wasn't just about betrayal anymore. This was war, and I was going to come out on top. The next evening, I made up my mind. It was time to stop ignoring the obvious. The tension simmering inside me had reached a boiling point, and I couldn't keep pretending that everything was normal. Melissa, my devoted, trustworthy wife, was about to face the first wave of consequences. When I walked into the kitchen, she was humming softly, her back turned as she worked at the counter. It struck me how calm she seemed, almost like nothing was amiss. How did she pull it off so effortlessly? She acted like the perfect homemaker, even though I knew what she'd been up to with that kid. I leaned casually against the counter, my arms crossed, and watched her for a moment. Finally, I broke the silence. "So," I said, keeping my voice light, "how's Jason doing these days?" Her hands paused for the briefest second before she turned to face me, her expression a picture of innocence. "Jason, oh, he's fine," she replied with a practiced smile. "Busy as ever, helping out wherever he's needed." "Helping out," I repeated, nodding slowly. "Yeah, he's been pretty helpful here too. So much so, it's almost like he's family." Let out a small laugh, though I noticed the tension behind it. "Don't be silly, Lucas. He's just a kid trying to earn some money. You said you didn't mind having him around to handle the heavier stuff." I smiled, but it didn't reach my eyes. "Oh, I don't mind. It's a big help, especially when it's backyard work," I said, emphasizing the words. Looked like he was really working hard out there the other night. Her smile faltered, and for a brief second, I caught a glimpse of thought, panic in her eyes. It was gone almost as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a thin layer of defiance. "What are you even talking about?" she asked, her voice sharper now. "Have you been spying on me?" "Spying?" I said, my laugh cold and humorless. "Why would I need to spy when you're making out with the neighbor's kid in plain sight?" Her arms crossed defensively, and she shot me a glare. "Oh, come on, Lucas. You're making this into something it's not. It was just a kiss. It didn't mean anything." "Just a kiss," I snapped, my voice rising. "You call sneaking around behind my back nothing while I'm working day and night to keep this house running. Are you kidding me?" Melissa rolled her eyes, and the mask finally came off. "God, you're so predictable," she said, her voice dripping with contempt. "Always playing the victim. Maybe if you weren't so boring all the time, I wouldn't have to look elsewhere for some excitement." For a moment, I was too stunned to respond. "Boring." I finally managed, my tone low and cold. "That's what you're going with. You're blaming me for sneaking around with some punk who probably still lives with his mom." Her gaze hardened. "Don't act like you're perfect," she fired back. "You're always working late, always too tired to do anything. Do you even remember the last time we had sex? Jason makes me feel alive, Lucas, something you haven't done in years." Her words cut like a blade, but I refused to let it show. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "You know what, Melissa?" I said, keeping my voice calm though my insides were burning. You're right. I've been predictable, but that's about to change. Her smug expression faltered as I turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving her standing there. I didn't her standing there need to yell or throw accusations. The real confrontation wasn't over yet, but I was done playing this game by her rules. That night, I felt something shift inside me. I wasn't just angry anymore. I was determined, and I wasn't about to let her walk away unscathed. The first thing I did was install cameras, small, discreet, and easy to hide. I set them up in the living room, the kitchen, and the backyard, places where their little rendezvous were most likely to happen. If they thought they could keep this up, I was going to catch them in the act. Next, I started recording our conversations. My phone became my silent witness, ready to document every excuse and manipulation that came out of Melissa's mouth. I didn't trust her words anymore, but I knew they'd be valuable ammunition later. Jason, though, was the real weak link. That idiot left evidence of their betrayal everywhere. His hoodie, his tools, the half-finished energy drinks scattered around the house. It was like he wanted to get caught. I began keeping a detailed log of everything, dates, times, what I saw, and what I suspected. This wasn't just about confronting Melissa. I wanted to make sure she couldn't deny a thing when the time came. In the midst of all this, I turned to my best friend, Dominic. Again, we'd been close since high school, and if anyone could help me think clearly, it was him. When I laid everything out for him, Dominic didn't sugarcoat his reaction. "Man, that's rough," he said, leaning back in his chair as we sat in his garage. "But listen, you can't lose your head over this. You've got to play it smart. Don't let your anger screw up your plan. If you're going all to go after her, do it right." And that's exactly what I intended to do. "I'm way past anger," I muttered, staring at the beer swirling in my hand. "This isn't about rage anymore. It's about making sure she doesn't walk out of this with a shred of dignity left." Dominic nodded, his jaw tightening as he leaned forward. "Good," he said, his voice steady. "But don't lose sight of the bigger picture, Lucas. This is your life we're talking about. If you play this right, you'll, well, come out stronger. Don't let her or your anger take that away from you." His words lingered, grounding me. As tempting as it was to blow everything up in a fit of rage, I knew he was right. Melissa wasn't just an ordinary cheater. She wasn't just an ordinary cheater. Sharp, manipulative, and calculating. If I rushed this, she'd find a way to spin it around and make me the bad guy. I couldn't let that happen. The tipping point came about a week later. We were watching TV, and Melissa sat beside me. We're watching TV, phone in hand. She thought I wasn't paying attention, but I noticed her lips curve into a faint smile as her fingers danced across the screen. That little smile, that eagerness, it told me everything I needed to know. I waited until she went to bed, then grabbed her phone from the counter. She'd gotten lazy with her password. It was the same code she'd been using for years. In seconds, I was in. What I found wasn't just flirting. It was so much worse. The texts between Melissa and Jason were filled with plans, complaints, and cruel remarks. She talked about how trapped she felt in her dull marriage. One message burned itself into my memory. "He's so clueless. Poor guy thinks I'm just stressed out." And then Jason's stressed out. And then Jason's reply, "Don't worry, babe. We'll figure something out. You deserve better than that loser." My hands shook as I scrolled through their messages, a mix of fury and grim satisfaction coursing through me. Melissa and Jason weren't just cheating, they were mocking me. I snapped photos of every incriminating text, capturing their cruelty in vivid detail. By the end of the night, I had everything I needed. Camera footage, text messages, logs. The pieces were all there, but I wasn't going to stop at confronting her. That would be too easy. Melissa and Jason needed to face the consequences of what they'd done. Not just to me, but to themselves. My first move was sending the evidence to Jason's parents. Respected the Millers. They were hardworking, decent people who didn't deserve to be dragged into this mess. Still, they had a right to know what their son had been doing. I waited until Melissa left for one of her so-called errands before sitting down to compose the email. I attached a video clip of Melissa and Jason kissing in the backyard, along with screenshots of their text messages. The email was short and direct. Subject: "Something you need to see, Mr. Miller, I'm sorry to bring this to your attention, but I thought you should know what Jason has been doing in my home with my wife. I've always respected your family, and I trust you'll handle this as you see fit. Sincerely, Lucas. I hit send and leaned back in my chair, a strange mix of dread and satisfaction washing over me. Jason's parents wouldn't ignore something like this, and whatever came next, I knew they'd deal with it. Next, I made a list of neighbors who needed to know. Mrs. Hoffman was at the top. She'd been the one to hint at Jason's frequent visits, and I knew she'd relish the chance to spread the news. I didn't send her everything, just enough for her to understand what was going on. By the end of the day, I started noticing the ripple effect. Mrs. Hoffman gave me a knowing nod when I stepped outside to grab the mail. Mr. Avery from down the street waved at me with a look of quiet sympathy. The whispers had begun, and it was only a matter of time before Melissa and Jason became the talk of the neighborhood. The real fallout started that evening. I wasn't expecting Jason's parents to show up so quickly, but there they were, standing on my porch. Mr. Miller looked furious, his lips pressed into a tight line. Mrs. Miller clutched her purse like it was the only thing keeping her upright. Lucas, Mr. Miller said, his voice strained. Can we talk? I nodded and stepped aside, letting them in. They sat stiffly on the couch, their expressions a mix of shame and anger. We had no idea. Mrs. Miller began, her voice trembling. We're so sorry, Lucas. This isn't how we raised him. I nodded, doing my best to keep my voice even. I figured you'd want to know. I didn't mean to drag you into this, but we'll handle it, Mr. Miller said firmly, cutting me off. His voice carried the weight of a man who didn't tolerate nonsense. Trust me, Lucas, this won't happen again. They left a short while later, leaving me with a strange sense of vindication. It wasn't much, but it was a start. That night, as I lay in bed, I felt something I hadn't in weeks: control. Melissa thought she'd been pulling the strings, but the game had shifted. This was my house, my life, and my rules, and I wasn't going to let her take any of it from me without a fight. He'll be home tonight, Mr. Miller had said firmly over the phone. And trust me, Lucas will make sure he understands just how badly he's screwed up. You have our word? I believed him. Jason might have been a sneaky, manipulative little punk, but his parents were cut from a different cloth. Decent, no-nonsense people who wouldn't tolerate this kind of behavior. That was one problem I could check off my list. By the next morning, the fallout had started to spread. The gossip mill was running full steam, and Melissa remained blissfully unaware. It wasn't until she returned from a quick grocery run, pale-faced and visibly rattled, that she realized something was up. I was lounging on the couch, flipping through channels, when she burst through the door and slammed it shut behind her. Her face was flushed, her breathing short. What the hell did you do, Lucas? She demanded, her voice sharp and frantic. I raised an eyebrow, keeping my tone casual. What are you talking about? Don't play dumb, she snapped, pacing the room like a caged animal. People were staring at me, whispering behind my back. Even the cashier wouldn't look me in the eye. I shrugged, feigning indifference. My words gotten out about your little after-hours activities with Jason. Her face went crimson, and for a moment, it looked like she was about to explode. But then, as always, she adjusted her strategy. You're pathetic, she spat, her voice dripping with contempt. What kind of man stoops to this level? I stood slowly, meeting her glare head-on. The kind of man who's done being lied to, I said, my voice steady but firm. The kind of man who's tired of being made a fool of. Everyone knows the truth now, Melissa. You don't get to hide behind your lies anymore. Her jaw tightened, her lips parting like she wanted to fire back. But no words came out. Instead, she spun on her heel and stormed upstairs, the sound of the bedroom door slamming echoing through the house. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt like I was back in control. That evening, I heard the unmistakable sound of shouting from outside. Peeking through the window, I saw Mr. and Mrs. Miller standing on my porch, with Jason in tow. Mr. Miller's booming voice carried across the street as he ripped into his son, his anger palpable even from a distance. Jason, for all his bravado, stood there like a scolded child, his shoulders slumped, his head bowed. I didn't need to step outside. Instead, I stayed inside, watching as the Millers loaded Jason into their car and drove off across the street. Neighbors peeped out from behind curtains, their curiosity and judgment practically visible. Jason's reputation was done for, and Melissa's wasn't far behind. That night, I slept better than I had in months. The weight of the lies and betrayal felt lighter, replaced by a newfound determination. Melissa thought she could control the narrative, but she underestimated me. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The next morning, I woke with a clear plan. Melissa wasn't going to walk away from this with a shrug and an empty apology. If she thought I was predictable, she was about to find out just how wrong she'd been. She came downstairs around noon, dressed casually, but the confidence I'd grown so used to seeing on her face was gone. She hesitated at the bottom of the stairs, her eyes darting toward me as I sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by piles of evidence, bank statements, emails, screenshots. My laptop sat open in front of me. "Morning," she said cautiously. I didn't look up. "Afternoon," I replied curtly, flipping through a document. She lingered by the counter, fidgeting with her sleeve. "We need to talk," she said, her voice quieter now. I shut the laptop and leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms. "You're right. We do. Sit down." Her eyes widened slightly. She hadn't expected me to take control. Reluctantly, she pulled out a chair and sat across from me, her posture stiff and guarded. "I'm sorry," she began, her voice shaking slightly. "I know I've made mistakes." "Mistakes," I said, cutting her off. My tone was cold, deliberate. "Melissa, a mistake is something accidental. Forgetting to pick up bread at the store is a mistake. Carrying on an affair with a neighbor for weeks, might be months, is a choice, a selfish, deliberate choice." She flinched but quickly regained her composure. "I wasn't happy, Lucas," she said, her tone defensive. "You don't know how lonely I've been. You're always working, always tired. I didn't mean for it to happen, but Jason, he listened to me. He made me feel wanted, I repeated, a bitter laugh escaping me. "What you mean is he made you feel young, exciting, like you weren't tied down to the boring old guy who actually gives a damn about this house and this marriage." Her mouth opened to protest, but I held open to protest. Up a hand, cutting her off. "No, you don't get to talk your way out of this. I've spent weeks piecing this together, watching you sneak around, listening to you blame me for your decisions. I'm done, Melissa." Her expression shifted, anger, now replacing regret. "You're blowing this out of proportion," she snapped. "People cheat all the time. That doesn't mean I don't love you." "Love," I said, my voice rising. "Love isn't kissing Jason in my backyard. Love isn't texting him behind my back and laughing about how clueless I am. Love isn't betraying the person who stood by you for years. So don't sit there and insult me with the years. That nonsense." She crossed her arms, glaring at me. "Fine. What do you want, then? A divorce?" "Exactly," I said, standing. "But first you're leaving this house. Today." Her jaw dropped, her confidence gone. "You can't be serious," she stammered. I walked to the door, grabbed the duffel bag I packed with her essentials, and dropped it at her feet. "I'm dead serious," I said firmly. "You can take this and go. The rest of your things can wait, but you're done here." "You can grab the rest of your things another time," I said, my voice cold and final. "But as of final, today you're no longer welcome here. The locks are being changed this afternoon." Melissa glared at me, her fists clenching at her sides. "You can't do that," she hissed. "This is my house too." "Not anymore," I replied, my tone cutting through the room like ice. "I have more than enough proof of what you've been up to. You won't get a dime from me in court. So I hope your little thrill with Jason was worth it." She looked like she was about to spit out one last manipulative excuse, but I wasn't giving her the chance. "Get out," I said firmly. Melissa grabbed her bag and stormed out, slamming the door behind her. The echo of the slam lingered for a moment, but then it was gone, leaving the house silent for the first time in weeks. It felt like mine again. I stood there for a moment, letting that silence wash over me, then got to work. I spent the afternoon boxing up her remaining things, clothes, toiletries, whatever she might need for a while, and stacked the boxes on the porch. By the time the locksmith showed up, I felt like I'd shed a layer of dead weight. Whatever Melissa chose to tell herself about the situation, it didn't matter. I had taken back control of my life. That night, I sat in the dim living room with a beer in hand, watching the neighborhood settle into stillness. One by one, the lights in the houses flickered off, and a quiet calm blanketed the street. My thoughts wandered back to the years I'd spent with Melissa. The laughter, the plans, the promises, all of it felt like a distant memory now. She'd thrown it all away for Jason. For what? A fling? A few moments of excitement? I didn't know, and honestly, I didn't care. What mattered was that I was finally free. But Melissa wasn't the only one who needed to face the consequences of her action. Jason wasn't walking away from this without scars either. The day after Melissa left, Jason's parents came to see me again. This time, they left Jason at home, or wherever he was. Staying now. When I opened the door, Mr. Miller's face was etched with barely controlled fury, and Mrs. swollen. "Lucas," Mr. Miller said, his voice heavy. "I can't tell you how ashamed we are. I thought we raised him better than this." "He's got nerve, I'll give him that," I replied, stepping aside to let them in. Trembled as she spoke, clutching her bag like it was holding her together. "We've told him he's not welcome at home until he takes responsibility. But he doesn't seem to care." That didn't surprise me. Jason had always struck me as someone who thought he could skate through life consequence-free. I poured them each a cup of coffee and sat across from them at the kitchen table. "Look," I said after a moment, "I appreciate you coming by, but Jason's your mess to clean up now. I've got my hands full dealing with mine." Mr. Miller nodded grimly. "We just wanted you to know," he said, his jaw tight. "We're cutting him off. No more money, no more safety net. He's on his own now." That was the best news I'd heard all week. Jason's cocky attitude had always stemmed from knowing his parents would catch him if he fell. Without their financial support, he'd have to face reality for once. Later that day, I saw him walking down the street. His shoulders were hunched, and his head hung low. He didn't even glance toward my house, but I wasn't going to let him slink away unnoticed. "Hey, Jason," I called out, stepping onto the porch. He stopped, his body stiffening as though he'd been caught in a trap. Slowly, he turned to face me. His expression was a mix of guilt and defiance, but there was no fight left in his eyes. "What do you want?" he muttered, barely meeting my gaze. I smirked, leaning against the porch railing. "Just wanted to let you know everyone in this neighborhood knows exactly what kind of person you are. You thought sneaking around with a married woman made you a big man." Pathetic. His face flushed, but he didn't respond. I could see the wheels turning, struggling to come up with a defense, but I wasn't about to give him the time. "You thought you could play me for a fool," I said, my tone sharp. "Well, guess what? You're done. Your parents are done with you. The neighbors won't even look at you. And as far as I'm concerned, you're nothing." For a brief moment, his jaw tightened, and I half expected him to take a swing at me. But he didn't. Instead, he turned and walked away, his fists clenched at his sides. That night, I heard through the grapevine that Jason's parents had officially kicked him out. He tried crashing with a friend, but even that arrangement didn't last anything to do with him anymore. I won't lie, there was a flicker of pity for him. He was young, reckless, and clearly clueless about the damage he'd caused. But that pity was fleeting. Jason had made his choices, and now he had to live with them. As for Melissa, I heard she was staying with some distant relative a few towns over. She'd been texting and calling me, leaving voicemails that ranged from apologetic to furious. I ignored every single one. The neighborhood gossip eventually quieted, but the damage was done. Jason was a ghost, Melissa was out of my life, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was moving forward. That night, I sat on the porch, a drink in hand, watching the stars overhead. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but knowing they were both paying the price for their actions made it easier to breathe. For the first time in months, I felt like I could finally start over. Looking back on everything that had happened, I realized my downfall wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming control over my life, my choices, and my future. For too long, I'd been the guy who avoided conflict, the guy who let things slide to keep the peace. Not anymore. This was my turning point, and I wasn't looking back. With Melissa and Jason out of my life, I finally had the space to reflect. The betrayal, the lies, the humiliation. It was a storm I never saw coming, but I wasn't storm I never saw coming. Going to let it define me. I'd made it through the worst, and now it was time to rebuild. The first step was focusing on myself. I'd spent years pouring all my energy into work and maintaining the house, thinking that was enough to keep my marriage intact. But now I saw how much I'd been neglecting my own well-being. So I dusted off my old gym membership card and started going a few nights a week. At first, it was tough, but as the weeks went on, I found myself looking forward to the challenge. The sweat, the burn, the sense of accomplishment. It reminded me that I was still capable of growth. My best friend, Dominic, became my unofficial therapist. We'd meet up a few times a week, either for drinks or to hang out in his garage. His blunt advice was exactly what I needed. "You dodged a bullet," he said one night, sipping a beer. "Melissa was dead weight, man. You're better off without her." "Yeah, but it doesn't make it hurt any less," I admitted. "I still think about the good times. You know, were they even real? Or was it all a lie?" Dominic shook his head. "Nah, they weren't a lie. But people change, Lucas, and sometimes the person they turn into isn't someone you want to keep around. It sucks, but you've got to stop looking back and start focusing on what's next." With Dominic's help, I started reconnecting with people I'd lost touch with during my marriage. Old friends, family, people I hadn't talked to in years. One by one, I reached out to them, apologizing for my absence and explaining what had happened. Most of them were shocked, but they were supportive, and it felt like I was rebuilding my foundation, one relationship at a time. Even my sister, Margaret, stepped up in ways I hadn't expected about Melissa. I'd always been skeptical about Melissa. She never said so outright now. She was checking in on me regularly, bringing over home-cooked meals and dragging me out of the house. One Friday night, she showed up holding a pair of tickets to a local concert. "Come on," she said, waving them in front of me. "You've got to get out of this house. It's starting to smell like takeout and pity." I laughed, but I knew she was right. So I went. For the first time in months, I felt like myself again, laughing, enjoying the folk music, remembering what it felt like to just live. The biggest challenge was dealing with the house. Everywhere I turned, there were memories of Melissa. Some good, but most of them tainted now. The backyard where she kissed Jason, the kitchen where we'd argued, the bedroom where we used to dream together. I couldn't live with those ghosts anymore. I called a real estate agent and started the process of putting the house on the market. It wasn't easy. This had been my home for years, a place I thought I'd grow old in. But I knew I couldn't truly move on while I was surrounded by reminders of what I'd lost. As I packed up boxes and sorted through old photos, I found myself smiling at the good memories. They didn't hurt as much anymore. They were part of my past, but they didn't have to control my future. When the house finally sold, I moved into a smaller place in another part of town. It wasn't as big or as polished, but it was mine, a fresh start in every sense of the word. I spent the first night there sitting on the floor with a pizza box and a beer, feeling a strange mix of sadness and hope. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I was truly in control of my life. The days turned into weeks, and I started to notice the little things that made life better. I had more energy. I felt lighter, more confident. People seemed to notice it too, smiling at me, striking up conversations. It was like the weight of Melissa's betrayal had been lifted, and I was free to be myself again. Moving on wasn't easy, but it was necessary, and with every step forward, I felt closer to the man I wanted to be. Dominic came over one evening, bringing a six-pack and a fellow teacher from his school, Rachel. She was warm, witty, and refreshingly straightforward. As the three of us sat on my new patio, talking and laughing under the stars, I caught myself feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time. Possibility. "You know," Dominic said later, after Rachel had left, "she asked about you. What did you tell her?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "The truth," he replied. "That you're a good guy who got a raw deal but is getting back on his feet." She seemed impressed by that. I nodded, not quite ready to dive into anything new, but for the first time since Melissa, I felt open to the idea that there might be something or someone worth looking forward to. 6 months after Melissa left, I ran into her at a grocery store across town. She looked different, thinner, less put together, her confident stride replaced by a cautious shuffle. When she saw me, she froze, her eyes widening with recognition and something else. Regret, might be. For a moment, we just stood there, the awkwardness hanging between us like a physical thing. Then, she spoke, her voice smaller than I remembered. Lucas, she began. But I cut her off with a raised hand. Don't, I said, not unkindly. There's nothing left to say. She nodded, her eyes dropping to the floor. I heard you sold the house. I did, I replied. Fresh start? That's good, she said, and I was surprised to hear genuine relief in her voice. You deserve that. As I walked away, I felt no anger, no bitterness, just a quiet acknowledgement that someone. Chapters need to end before new ones can begin. Later that night, as I sat on my new deck with Dominic and a few other friends, sharing stories and laughter under the warm glow of string lights, I realized something important. Melissa's betrayal had broken something in me, but in rebuilding myself, I become stronger, more authentic, more alive. To new beginnings, Dominic said, raising his beer in a toast. To new beginnings, we echoed, and as our bottles clicked together, I felt a marsh surge of gratitude for the painful lessons that had brought me here, to this moment, to these people, to this version of myself. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, I was looking forward to the journey. After all, the best revenge isn't about destroying someone else. It's about building something better for yourself from the ashes they left behind. Subscribe and stay one step ahead of cheaters. And trust me, the next story makes this one look like a fairy tale.